So our next speaker is Ian Lanzillotti, speaking about the North Caucasus beyond nation and state. Ian Lanzillotti is a member of the ANCS Board of Directors and assistant professor at Washington and Jefferson College. His scholarship focuses on the North Caucasus, nationalism, identity, and political belonging. Dr. Lanzillotti is the author of a recently published book titled Land, Community, and the State in the Caucasus, Kabardino-Balkaria from Tsarist Conquest to Post-Soviet Politics. Using previously untapped Russian archival sources and the works of local North Caucasian historians and ethnographers, he examines intercommunal relations, the evolution of imperial rule and governance, and the causes of peace and violence in the North Caucasus. During his fieldwork in the North Caucasus, Ian was hosted by Lydia's family in Nalchik and by several other families throughout Kabardino-Balkaria. I'm sure you have many tales of kidnappings and peace. Through these experiences, he learned the Circassian language and built meaningful relationships and lasting friendships within the local community, which is apparent today. So welcome, Ian. I will just have to, again, try to share your presentation here. Hopefully it lets me do it this time. And we just have to
Thank you so much, Alika, and thank you to Lydia and Diego and Alika for organizing this really important and much needed new organization. It's something I wished when I started studying the region, decade and a half, 2 decades ago, I don't know, lost track, 2 decades ago, that I wish had existed to connect me with other scholars focusing on the region. And, as I mentioned before briefly, I really hope that this could also eventually serve as a bridge between scholars who study the North Caucasus, in North America and scholars in the region. That would be a wonderful thing if that can happen. So when I was asked to kind of talk about different frameworks for studying the Caucasus, one thing that came to mind is the way in which, at least I'm a historian, so the way in which the history of the North Caucasus is often divided between kind of the Northwest Caucasus and the Northeast Caucasus, and that also follows linguistic divisions, Northwest Caucasian languages, Northeast Caucasian languages. But in my research, I found a different sort of regional framework, very helpful, a framework that and I talked about this earlier, that kind of tries to go beyond the ways in which modern national borders and administrative boundaries have defined the scope of many historical studies, particularly, Soviet era scholarship and even beyond into post-Soviet era. And so in my research, I have found a different regional framework for understanding that I think leads to some new and important insights on the history of the Caucasus. And so I'm going to talk about one of those that I used in my project, which is conceptualizing a region called the Central Caucasus. It's not something that I came up with. I'll talk to you about who I found, which North Caucasus-based scholar influenced me in that, in conceptualizing and thinking about this region, Central Caucasia, the Central Caucasus. But it's one that I used in my PhD dissertation turned book, Land, Community, and the State in the Caucasus. And so the book itself was focused on studying the kind of interrelations among the peoples who make up today's Kabardino-Balkar Republic in the North Caucasus. My question, kind of when I started looking at the region, was, to explain the relative absence of, violent interethnic conflict in Kabardino-Balkaria. Well, the relationship between Kabardians and Balkars, the titular nationalities of this republic, hasn't been trouble-free. It didn't descend into the sort of violent armed conflict that we'd seen in other parts of the region, from Abkhazia to Chechnya and elsewhere. The Ossetian-English conflict, for example, as well. And so I wanted to understand that. I wanted to understand why these communities were together in a shared administrative unit: Kabardino-Balkaria, Kabardians, Circassian-speaking people, Balkars, Kipchak, Turkic-speaking people. And so, I wanted to understand their specific relationship. But in order to trace those relations, I realized that I needed to research and ultimately write a multi-ethnic history that encompassed a much wider web of relations than just Kabardians and Balkars, and ultimately the Cossacks and Russians who would settle the region as well, and kind of cast a wider net in many ways. So it involved looking at a historic system of intercommunal relations that once encompassed the regions that are home to today's Kabardians, Balkars, Ossetians, English, some Abaza, Karachay, so a much larger territory, which we could talk about as the Central Caucasus. So again, one of my goals in my project was to avoid imposing modern ethno-national borders on the region's history. And so you have that. You also have so kind of in scholarship in the North Caucasus, Soviet era, post-Soviet era, you have this tendency to take those kind of modern ethno-national borders to delimit the kind of fields of research that we've studied to determine, the limits of our research. And then in kind of Western scholarship, or scholarship in North American and other scholars outside of the region, there's this tendency to focus on this sort of Northwest Caucasus and Northeast Caucasus, which sort of a result of the attention that has been given to war, right, to the Caucasian Wars in particular, where you have as Alika mentioned, right, the resistance in Chechnya, what is today Chechnya and Dagestan, led by Imam Shamil for so long, and ending in 1859. Then you have in the Northwest Caucasus the Circassian resistance, 1864, right, and so you have these two examples that have kind of determine in many ways the regional frameworks that we use when looking at the North Caucasus. But the Central Caucasus that I'm going to look at is an area that doesn't fit into either of those two stories of resistance. Not that the region didn't resist; it resisted differently at different times. And so let me kind of go forward. Yeah. So the Central Caucasus. Let me talk to you a little bit quickly about how we define this region, right? So. Ultimately, the Central Caucasus as a historic region is conceived of by, or at least I was influenced by the scholar Rustam Begaulov, who was a professor of history at Umar Aliyev Karachay-Cherkess State University, so in the Republic of Karachay-Cherkessia in the North Caucasus. He specializes in the history of interethnic relations in Karachay-Cherkessia and surrounding regions. And in 2000, I think it's 2005, he published a book called Central Caucasus from the 17th century to the first quarter of the 19th century, outline of ethno-political history. And so this region, roughly the size of like maybe the Netherlands at its greatest historical extent, encompasses the Russian Federation's republics of Kabardino-Balkaria, North Ossetia, much of Ingushetia, the eastern parts of Karachay-Cherkessia, and the southernmost parts of Stavropol Krai. Geographically, it's situated roughly between Europe's highest mountain, Mount Elbrus, in the southwest, and Mount Kazbek in the southeast. Central Caucasia's shortest side then is its natural southern border along the Caucasus mountain range, which stretches about 130 miles between these two mountains. The Central Caucasus is bounded by the upper bank of the Kuban River in the west, the right bank of the Kuban River, I should say, in the west, and the Kuma Podkumok rivers in the northwest, the Kura in the north, and the Terek in the northeast and east, and the Sunja River in the east. So this is a region that ultimately had been controlled to a certain extent, one way or another, by the ethnically Circassian Princely Confederation of Kabarda, which again it exercised varying degrees of political, social, and economic power, suzerainty maybe over the highland peoples, right? Who we today describe as Ossetians and Balkars and Karachay, and some English, from about the 16th century through most of the 18th century. And what happens in this territory is you have what I describe as a Kabarda-centered system of intercommunal relations. And ultimately, my book argues that the peaceful relationship between Kabardians and Balkars has at its root the symbiotic, though unequal system of intercommunal relations that existed in the Central Caucasus prior to the Russian conquest that began, late 18th, early 19th centuries, and that this relationship continued in evolving and modified forms through the 19th and into the beginning of the 20th century. And this symbiotic relationship was based on each community occupying complementary ecological niches. So Kabardians were peoples of the plains and foothills, Balkars, highlanders, and so the two communities depended on each other to a certain, to varying degrees. Kabarda's control, or the princes of Kabarda's control over lowland pastures, were vital in the winters for highland communities who were transhuman, practice transhumance, right? They would move with their cattle, sheep, to lowland pastures where they in the winters. And so Kabarda's control over those lowland pastures was the means by which they were able to collect tribute from highland communities and hold them in various states of tributary relations. And that sort of economic power also led to social and cultural and political influence that the Kabardian princes held over highland communities. And while Highlander communities depended on the foothills and plains pastures during late autumn and early spring, many Kabardian communities needed the alpine meadows of their neighbors in the highlands for grazing their cattle in the summer months. And with the gradual assertion of Tsarist Russian control from the second half of the 18th century, ultimately the scope and power of the Kabarda-centered system gradually shrunk. And so that by the time Russian power was secured in this Central Caucasus region in the second half of the 19th century, Balkars and a minority of Ossetian and Karachay Highlander communities remained in a land-based dependence. But most of the other Highland communities had sort of settled the plains, had moved from the highlands, or at least some of them migrated down to lands that had previously been controlled, at least for several centuries, by Kabarda. Nevertheless, the legacies and the remnants of this system continued to play an important role in social life and politics in the Central Caucasus long after Russian conquest and sort of into the contemporary period in many ways. And so when I talk about the Central Caucasus, it doesn't form, like, as we've been talking about, it's not a hard border. It doesn't negate other ways of conceptualizing the region geographically, politically, culturally, linguistically. However, I argue that this framework is really salient when trying to understand the history of the peoples of the Caucasus, the North Caucasus, from about the 16th century up to the imposition of modern national boundaries in the early 20th century. Let's see here. Oops, I went I got ahead of myself in my notes, but I had some other slides here to kind of illustrate what I was talking about, right? So Kabarda is a princely confederation that formed and established its kind of power by the 16th century. The relations between Kabarda and the highland communities to the south were symbiotic, but clearly unequal. It is based on, these communities occupying complementary ecological niches. And again, the power of princely Kabarda receded with the assertion of Tsarist Russian rule. Kabarda resisted Russian rule in many ways earlier than some of the other communities, say in the Northwest Caucasus, where Russia didn't sort of begin its conquest until well into the 19th century. Kabardian resistance had begun, in the 1870s, late 1860s, late 1760s, and then into the 1770s. And so Kabarda itself had been largely, pacified, conquered, subdued, brutally, in brutal fashion by Yermolov, the famous Russian general, certainly by 1825, if not earlier. And so the power of Kabarda over its neighbors had receded by that point in many ways. So that here's a kind of visual of some of these other ways of thinking about the North Caucasus, right? You have this sort of Northwest Caucasus and Northeast Caucasus as frameworks. And so the Northwest Caucasus, I would argue, makes a lot of sense in kind of the post-Soviet history of the North Caucasus, where contemporary ethno-national movements and identities, as Dago, I think, talked about, right, this kind of cross-border ties. I think to all of us, to an extent, have been talking about ties across borders, right? So the modern ethno-national movements and identities that we see in the post-Soviet era, cut across the boundaries of these, republics that we see in this Northwest Caucasus, right? So Circassian identity includes Kabardians who live in Kabardino-Balkaria, Cherkess in Karachay-Cherkessia, Adigetse and Adigea, as well as Shapsugs in Krasnodar region, and there's some smaller Circassian communities even in Stavropol region. So if we think about these kind of projects that we see in the post-Soviet period of forging these broader national identities and national movements, then thinking about the Northwest Caucasus makes sense, as well as like the Karachay and Balkars, right? This kind of broader Karachay-Balkar movement that cuts across borders as well. And even we talked about the Abkhaz, right? The Abaza-Abkhaz connection, and there's organizations that bring together Abkhaz and Abaza in a kind of movement. So the Northwest Caucasus really makes sense when you're thinking about kind of post-Soviet history. In many ways. So my new project, I want to conclude by talking a little bit about another, framework that I've been thinking about that I think transcends the borders of nation and state in many ways. And to talk to harken back to Sarah's presentation, kind of North-South Caucasus connections. So rather than seeing the mountains and as a kind of barrier, right? To quote the title of a book that came out, I think, in the early 90s, The North Caucasus Barrier, right? I think in many ways, as we've been talking about, there are these really important cultural, economic, obviously geographic connections, but social, political connections that cut across boundaries, right? So, in terms of material culture, non-material culture, social and political structures, economic orientations, right? The Caucasus mountain range, we shouldn't see it, right, as this firm boundary or barrier. North Caucasus, Balkar, and Ossetian highland communities trekked across the mountain passes into Georgian regions in Svaneti and Racha to trade and sometimes for protection. Of course, you have close ties between Chechens and Hevsors. The defensive towers, which you can see in these images in Svaneti and Balkaria, are very similar in terms of architectural influences and borrowing from one another in that regard. And of course, ethnicities and or ethno-linguistically related communities are found on both sides of the borders, right? So we've mentioned earlier Abkhaz, Abaza similarities, Ossetians, as Diego mentioned, that bridge between North and South Caucasus, Vainakh peoples, the Kists and the Batsbi of the Pankisi Gorge and Tusheti, linguistically connected to Chechens and English, Lezgins as well, right? Traversing both sides of that North-South Caucasus divide. And so one of the things that, my research, my previous project that tuned me to was on long-standing connections across the mountains between highland communities and Balkars, now describe them as, and like Svan and other Georgian Highlander communities. And in some of my research, I came across documents related to the deportation, of course, of the Balkars and Karachay and other peoples by Stalin, under Stalin's orders, and Beria involved as well, of course, during World War II. And I became interested in some of the sources I found when territory from the North Caucasus republics had been transferred to the Georgian SSR, right, to the Georgian Republic. So most of Karachay, from the Karachay autonomous region previously, which was dissolved after the deportation of the Karachay, and then portions of the Balkar mountain regions were annexed to the Georgian Republic, as well as portions of the Checheno-English SSR were also annexed to Georgia in 1944. And so I became interested in understanding what happens to this territory when it's under Georgian rule, how it is resettled by Georgian Highlanders who, prior to this, one question I have is, what kinds of understanding did they have about this region, ostensibly in the North Caucasus? How was this a totally new, place for them? What was their experiences like, and how did the Georgian government itself try, approach developing this region or not developing it? And other questions that kind of. In terms of historiography, how did the histories of of Georgia, right, change as a result of the incorporation of this new territory into the Georgian SSR? How did they Georgify it, in a sense, historiographically, and justify inclusion of this, North Caucasus territories into the Georgian SSR? So that's one of the things that I'm thinking about now. And so the two districts that I'm looking at are the Plukhori district, which was composed of territory from Karachay from Karachay Autonomous Oblast and from the Balkar lands of Kabardino-Balkaria, which was resettled by Svans and Rachians. And then the Akhalkhevi district, which was taken from sort of the Chechen or English SSR, and resettled by neighboring Highlander communities from Georgia of Khivsors and Tushetians. And so here you can see a Georgian map, right, of these areas that are brought in white across the border. So that's something that I'm looking forward to hopefully doing some archival research on in the future. But again, my thinking about how I'm conceptualizing what kind of questions I'm interested in studying for the history of the North Caucasus, right, is in many ways thinking about the role of geography, the mountains and the plains, and how that has historically structured social life, interactions in the region, over the longue durée. So thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions.